Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Glacier Wisdom, and I'm the President and CEO of Greater Louisville, Inc. Thank you for being with us today. With the support and encouragement from many of you on this call, we are grateful to host this conversation today. GLI recognizes the significance of these times and the deep emotions felt in our community. Many of us are still processing the news from yesterday and how Louisville can heal and move forward. There's no better time than now to have this very discussion on how we've come together and identified solutions to address racial inequities within our justice system and how we can make our community safe for everyone and allow people to realize their fullest human potential. To help drive this work, the formation of GLI's Business Council to End Racism, led by Cynthia Napeth with Leadership Louisville Center and Ralph Deschabert of Brown Forman, as well as Geraldine Green of Young Brands. It's an important first step. To the council members joining us today, I look forward to the post-event discussions that we'll have with the CJ reform and the law enforcement work stream. And a special thank you to our event and council sponsors, Morales Group Staffing, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Tops Magazine. Our series event sponsor, the Oliver Group, and our Business Council to End Racism sponsors, Brown Forman, Humana, and Young Brands. Lastly, thank you to our presenting sponsor, who you will hear from shortly, Papa John's International, for making the DE&I event series possible. We value your support. Now, I would like to turn it over to our Criminal Justice Reform and Law Enforcement Workstream leader, David Tandy of Council with Denton's Bingham Greenbaum. David?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon to everyone who is participating in this conversation that we're having. I have to be honest with you, when we were thinking about everything that's going on in our community currently, the question was asked, should we move forward with today? And action to that was unequivocally yes, because to be honest with you, there's a lot of issues that we as a community have to address and we need to face head on. In this day and time, I'm reminded of the last 6 words of the Pledge of Allegiance that say, with liberty and justice for all. And that's at the crux of what we are going to talk about today. What does liberty and justice look like in Louisville and in our country? What has it looked like in Louisville, in our country throughout the years? And has liberty and justice been equally accessible to all people, in particular to African American people and other people of color in this country? You know, if we were going to be honest about this conversation, we would say, you know, throughout our history, we've seen that there were 2 systems of justice in our country, one for the majority and one for the minority. And one of the things, as we go through this conversation, the whole point of this conversation is not to disparage one group over another. It's not to guilt trip anybody one way or another. But what we are attempting to do is to see if we as a community can have what I call empathy for one another. Can we see ourselves in another person? Can we recognize that we can have 2 schools of thought, that we can be for law and order while at the same time wanting to see justice be served, and make sure that that justice is being served across the board? And so that is my hope that we will be able to engage in today and in conversations, because I will remind everyone of this. We did not arrive into the place where we are today overnight. This has been a 400-year process that we've been dealing with racism in all of its various forms, in prejudice, in bias, whatever we want to call it. We've been dealing with it for a mighty long time. And the fact of the matter is, for us to come out of it, it's going to take us some time to do that as well. It's going to require us to have open and honest conversations with ourselves and with others about what we are seeing and experiencing in this country and in our community. It's going to require us to be willing to challenge some of the long-held thoughts and beliefs that we may have had about what our criminal justice system looks like, how it operates, for whom it operates for, and make the choice to be about positive change. My hope is that we won't allow for this discussion, for our work through these work streams, this conversation that we're having today, just to be another conversation in the long history of conversations that we've had in this country, particularly about race. But that we, Business Council, will make those concerted efforts and those concerted steps to be the leaders, to be the citizen leaders that all of us are called upon to be, and to bring about the type of Louisville that we want to see, not only for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children. And so with that, I want to turn the program over to our title sponsor, Papa John's, and I want to allow Victoria Russell, of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Papa John's, to have her remarks. Victoria?
Thank you, David. I couldn't agree more with your sentiments. Completely share that. And I want to thank you, Sarah, GLI, and all the business leaders who've come together to join the Council to End Racism. More now than ever, that work is needed. And I'm glad we're taking the lead to do that. At Papa John's, we've been on a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey for more than 2 years now. It's so important to the success of our business that we've made creating a culture of leaders who believe in diversity, inclusivity, and winning the #1 strategic priority for the company. Now, as the fight for racial justice continues in our communities and in our country, we aspire to create the kind of culture in our company that we'd like to see in the rest of the world, and a culture we can all be proud of. Now I'd like to turn your attention to a quick video as we think about delivering thanks. Today, we have Dr. Cherie Dawson-Edwards, Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Louisville. She also directs the College of Arts and Sciences Social Change minor. She holds a PhD in Public Policy and Administration from Virginia Commonwealth University and a Master's of Science in Justice Administration from U of L. Dr. Dawson-Edwards has taught a variety of criminal justice courses, but her research and teaching interests center on the intersection of public policy and criminal justice, with a specific focus on schools and juvenile justice. After her presentation, David Tandy will help moderate some discussion questions before we open up to Q&A from the audience. Dawson-Edwards, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I really appreciate you all having me here today. I echo both Victoria and David's concerns about where we are in this space, in this moment in our community. I too am from Louisville. I was born here. I can answer the "what school did you go to" question. I went to the Brown School, shout out Brown School. I just want to give some context to what I plan to talk about and what I plan to converse with David about after my 15 minutes of presenting. So a lot of thought went into what this could be. I was kind of given the green light to talk about whatever I wanted to as it related to justice in Louisville, with the historical context, the present, and then forward thinking into the future. And to put this all together several weeks ago when I was invited to talk, and the closer that we got to what yesterday became, the more difficult it was for me to decide what we should talk about. So what I plan to do is talk for a few minutes about the past related to justice in Louisville, and a little bit about the past related to policing in Louisville. And then I want us to sit with the moment of the present and think a little bit about the future and what that means. Now, I'm an academic, like I'm not a business person. My dad was, I am not. I'm not here in a capacity to consult with business leaders about what you all should do. What I am here is as a person who understands our justice system. I understand our justice processes. I understand the flaws. I understand what it's like to be a Black woman, mother, Black kids, and wife of a Black husband in Louisville, Kentucky. And so one of the things that I have to put out there is that I show up to all the spaces that I go to talk about these things as those things. And so I can be a professor and I can be a higher ed administrator, but I'm a mom first, and I navigate this world in my intersections as a Black woman in Louisville. And so what this moment means to me is going to probably come out in this conversation. And I let everyone know that yesterday when we decided to have this conversation today, so soon after we heard a decision that has many people in our community hurting and traumatized, and a host of other different things. So let's just talk about some of the past, because I think in order for us to reconcile the present and move toward the future, we have to know what is, and we have to have a shared understanding of what the past of justice has been like in this country. And Louisville is not that different from other places in this country. So I have a few opening slides just to contextualize Louisville. I mean, I know that, Victoria graciously read my bio and talked about my research and teaching interests. And so while it's true that I focus mainly on racial disparities in juvenile justice, as well as those problems in school exclusionary discipline practices, the reason that I focus on those things is related to me not wanting kids to end up in the adult system. So a lot of focus on reform and activities is related to the adult criminal justice system. And I used to be like that too. My research used to be on reentry, programming and policies related to that. And then several years ago, I took a step back and I was like, you know what? I'm not sure that we can fix system. What can I do to keep people out of the current system? And that is why my research centers on youth and young people and trying to keep them out of a system. And that's not to say that I don't want people to try to fix the system. That's just to say the research that I was doing wasn't fixing anything. And so these are just some slides that kind of contextualize the problematic nature of racial disparities and justice in Louisville. And while this is focused on youth, the adult population pretty much overlays that. Like, we do not treat Black and brown folks well in our city as it relates to justice. I do want to talk really briefly about the prevailing explanations for why there are racial disparities in the justice system, whether it's juvenile justice or the adult criminal justice system. The two prevailing mechanisms or contributing mechanisms or theories are differential treatment or differential behavior or offending. Looks more at the structural systemic issues on why there may be racial disparities. Differential offending or behavior looks at the individual and says, oh, there's something about you or your group that behaves differently or is more criminal. I will say that in the research, even though people like to pull out one or two studies that support differential offending, the overarching research does not say that Black and brown folks offend differently or worse than white people offend. And so that is a common misperception that is not supported by literature and research. And so if that's not the case, overwhelmingly not the case, then what is the issue? Why do these disparities exist? And I think what you should know and recognize is that these disparities are not new. When I started doing research on disproportionate minority contact, that is a term that the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention used, and as a funded researcher, I had to use their term. It was called DMC. Now it's called RED, Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Juvenile Justice. It dawned on me that I had been teaching juvenile justice for years, and nobody ever talked about, like, what were the Black youth doing at the beginning of the juvenile justice system and juvenile court in Chicago. And I went and I found a book called The Black Child Savers that kind of talks about that. And so when you go back and look in the history of justice, whether it's adult criminal justice, whether it's corrections, policing, or juvenile justice, you will see a stark difference in the role that the system played for folks that look like me versus what the system played for folks that do not look like me. So I usually start my class, and bear with me, I'm standing up because I've been sitting all day and I'm still not used to teaching virtually, but presenting virtually by sitting down, it just doesn't work for me. But I start my classes off talking to my students on the campus of the University of Louisville about our history in justice. This building on the slide, the big building, is U of L's Brigman Hall. My office is at the very end of the top on the right-hand side. Beside it is the Southern Police Institute, which is also under the department that I chair. And so I don't know how many people know that U of L used to be a house of refuge, which is kind of like a precursor to a reformatory for juveniles. And that building still exists. I work there. I have worked there for 9 years, and there's history there about how justice works in Louisville, and then how the segregated justice worked in Louisville. So these are other buildings on our campus. These are the dormitories, and you can see that the one on the left says it's the dormitory 4, built in 1887. On the right, Gardner Hall, where actually I have a new appointment at U of L. My new office will be in Gardner Hall, is the girls' dorm for white girls. And then we have the House of Refuge building on the corner of 3rd and Eastern, that is now Patterson Hall. That was, part of the reformatory. And then Oppenheimer Hall, also, that was the Black male department. And so, we're looking at, and Oppenheimer, that was 1930s, that picture. If you go back, we're looking at the early 1900s, and we have always been separated. So I wanted to just throw some quick historical things, and then I want to get into 2020 and how people are talking about justice, how people are talking about justice reform, and then how they're talking about the past in an interesting kind of revisionist way. And so there's not a whole that's compiled about the history of criminal justice in Louisville. There are little pieces, there are books, there are excerpts that I will pull from. George Wright, an author, I know that there are folks in the Business Council or work stream that are reading his book or will be reading his book, but there are several books that I think help contextualize the history of justice in Kentucky, maybe not specifically to Louisville, but certainly in Kentucky. And so I'm sure you can see this slide and you can read it as I'm talking, but I want to reflect on something that happened to me 2 years ago. In 2018, I was able to go to Montgomery, Alabama, where the Equal Justice Initiative, or EJI, had just opened their lynching memorial and their legacy museum. They had a big conference, celebration, celebrities were there, blah, blah, blah. But I was one of the first people to go through their legacy museum, which is about, from slave importation to mass incarceration. And then I spent some time at the lynching memorial. And I don't know how many people have been there. If you haven't been there, that needs to be on your list of understanding racial injustice in our country and understanding racial injustice with the justice system, because you can clearly see the interactions and interconnectedness to the history of the justice system with racial terrorism, or racial terror lynchings, as they call it then. And so it was the first time I'd been in a space that captured everything that I'd been teaching in one particular space in this museum. And then the lynching memorial, of course, spoke to me as well. So we cannot negate that race has been part of our justice system. And if I'm with you all, people like to throw out these DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion words these days, and they're very comfortable with saying anti-racism. Lots of people have read the book, how to be an anti-racist, and we throw that word around, but we won't throw the word white supremacy around. That still triggers people. I'm going to charge you with, If you can't talk about white supremacy and you can't talk about how our systems and our structures have centered whiteness, then you're not ready to talk about anti-racism, because all of those things are part of the same conversation. And so I give you this particular page from one of Wright's books that talks about lynchings and oppression and the response that Black folks in Kentucky had to those particular things in the early 1900s. So I'm going to read it just for the purposes of us sitting with it for a minute. Kentucky Blacks did not willingly of the white majority. They formed organizations, appealed to state officials, and on several occasions armed themselves to protect their property or prevent lynchings. Indeed, during the 1870s and again in the early 1900s, Blacks challenged mobs by arming themselves and guarding the jailhouse to protect the lives of Blacks accused of rape or murder. After a lynching in Georgetown in August 1891, Blacks resorted to arson to extract the measurement of revenge, sending whites into a panic. On several occasions after lynching, whites grew so concerned about them arming themselves that I don't think I can see the bottom because it says stop sharing my screen. So it says that curfews and I believe militias were enacted. And so when I read this excerpt a couple of weeks ago, I was like, wow, this feels a lot like today if you're looking at something from someone else's lens, that people are not happy with Black Lives Matter, people wearing Black Lives Matter and saying Black Lives Matter. People are not happy with organizing. And what we're seeing is a lot of rhetoric and false narratives that come across because of that. And I want us to sit with this language about the 1870s, 1890s, and 1900s and make sure that as a community, we're not doing these same things today while people are organizing to fight for Black lives. So I don't ever want to give a blueprint for anything because I do not believe that there is another city like Louisville. Like I said, I'm from Louisville. I love Louisville. And there is no city like us. We have to figure out how to fix us or make us better on our own. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at other places and see what they're doing. And so I don't know if you've seen this report, but this is from Minneapolis. It's called Enough is Enough, a 150-year performance review of the department. And it was done by an organization called MPD 150. This book, it's a report, but it's also an audio book. So if you're like me and don't have a whole lot of time to read, you can listen to it, but you can just Google that and it'll come up. But what they did is they looked at where they've been, where they are, and where they want to go. And I decided for this conversation, and I would encourage the work stream to look further into where they are and where they want to go. But I decided for the purposes of this brief conversation to look at where they've been. And what they did is they looked at the history of the Minneapolis Police Department and broke it down in 4 eras. The first era was undeveloped policing. And we're going to talk a little bit about undeveloped policing here in a minute, but that's related to slave patrols and town watches, which have arguably been deemed the precursors to modern policing. They then looked at an era unprofessional policing. And criminal justice professors and researchers know that even when you look at overall law enforcement history in our country, we have eras that they talk about, and professionalizing is one of those areas. So then they looked at unrestrained policing, and then they decided this last era that they're in is unreformable. And so I'm not saying that these are our historical eras, but do we know what they are? And if we don't know what they are, then maybe that's the first step that we need to have in Louisville, is to understand our history, where we've been, where we are, and where we want to be. And we may not look like in Indianapolis at all, but it wouldn't hurt to model collecting this information in a similar way. So let's fast forward to 2020, and then we'll go back and forth between 2020 and the past. Earlier this Police magazine, the editor did an op-ed about defunding the police. And so this is just an excerpt of the things that this editor said. And the editor is a law enforcement officer. I believe he was a chief at a police department somewhere. But I want us to look at this and kind of unpack the perspective of police versus the perspective of other folks in their communities. So he wrote, ending all law enforcement in favor of restorative justice is a popular tenet of the radical left platform in this country, and it is gaining momentum. Now, I want you to remember that this is Police Magazine, so police officers read it. Abolishing law enforcement is the stated goal of some factions of the social justice movement. Defunding law enforcement agencies and giving the money to social justice programs is a common demand from Black Lives Matter groups. They claim that police cannot be reformed and that the very institution of law enforcement is racist. He then goes on to say, such incomplete and skewed understanding of history. Anti-police activists argue that the first organized law enforcement agencies in the American colonies were slave patrols. Calling those guys law enforcement and tracing the professional lineage of today's policing to them is an insult beyond measure. They were more like roving bands of bounty hunters and thugs. Most historians agree the first real professional law enforcement agency in the United States was the Boston Police Department. So I like this excerpt because I think what it does is perfectly pits people's perspectives against each other. And while there are elements of truth in this, there's also, what were the words that he used? Incomplete and skewed understanding of history. And there's semantics. And I really hope as a society we can get away from that and just communicate like adults and stop playing with words and semantics. And so the semantics here is that he said activists argue that the first organized law enforcement agencies in the American colonies were slave patrols. And so he threw organized in there because the reality is the first real professional law enforcement agency in history is given to the Boston Police Department. But much of the history says that slave patrols and town watches are in fact the precursors to modern day policing. So let's talk about slave patrols. So according to historian Gary Potter, slave patrols serve three main functions: to chase down, apprehend runaway slaves, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject outside the law. The first slave patrols were established in 1704 in South Carolina. And then even more research and historians talk about the role that these had as a enforcement in the early days of our country. The history of police work in the South grows out of this early fascination by white patrollers with what African American slaves were doing. Most law enforcement was by definition white patrolmen watching, catching, or beating Black slaves. And then you scroll down and there's an excerpt from the Louisville Courier-Journal. I guess it was just called the Louisville Courier then. And it says, Black populations in Indiana and Ohio shrank as hundreds of former slaves feared recapture. Abolitionists in Ohio refused to cooperate with slave catchers. The Louisville Courier reported the fugitive slave law cannot be executed in Ohio and probably never will. So there's even more evidence that historians and criminologists connect modern day policing with slave patrols. One of the more well-known race and justice scholars, 1980, describes these patrols as the first publicly funded police departments in the American South. Paddy rollers were to manage race-based conflict in the Southern colonies expressly through the control of slave populations. Then Haddon explains that the duties of patrols were to search slave lodges, keep slaves off roadways, and break up slave organized meetings. David and Melissa Barlow, who I know very well, note that the Charleston Police Department had 100 officers whose primary function was to patrol slaves by regulating their movements. This also included free Blacks, checking documents, enforcing slave codes, guarding against slave revolts, and catching runaway slaves. Now, when you just look at the history, you're like, oh, that doesn't sound like today because people are not slaves. But when you think about how people feel like their movement is regulated differently than others, how their documents are checked differently than others, how certain laws are enforced differently for some people. And then even if you look at the guarding against revolts and how people's perceptions of how some of the protests have been policed, then maybe you can see a little parallels with why people say the history of policing is important to understanding what we're talking about. today. So let's just talk a little bit about the Louisville Police Department. It was started in 1806 with 5 officers. They were to enforce all the laws in Louisville and harbor regulations. In December 1810, a new officer was hired as a watch for the city. Watches were paid $250 quarterly, or $62.50 a month. And then this is an older picture from the late 1800s, I believe, of Louisville police officers. In 1856, the General Assembly passed the act related to the police department in the city of Louisville, the office of the watchman, and established an actual police department. They decided later in that year that the police department would be modeled after those in eastern cities, and they had a chief of police. The city was divided into 11 police districts. By 1872, the department had grown to 180 men. So let's look at an excerpt from this book about policing in Louisville just after this. So we're looking at the 1850s, and this is about the early 1900s. It says, in September and October 1910, a white daily, the Louisville Evening Post, carried a series of stories detailing police abuse of Blacks. A story in the paper on September 8th told about a police officer following a Black woman for several blocks and firing several shots at her once she started running. Another article protested the arrest of innocent Blacks, noting that on one occasion, an officer arrested 4 men. On October 10th, the Evening Post explained that the cause of police mistreatment of Blacks was to establish in every home of a Negro man or woman in this city a condition of terrorism, a living fear of the billy and the revolver. So this is Louisville history. This is not another city. This is Louisville. And so we cannot pretend, and even though it says 1910 and we're in 2020, we cannot pretend that these things didn't exist and that people don't have a right to feel like these things still exist in some form today. Another excerpt says, throughout these years, the Louisville police abused Blacks at will, knowing that the courts would likely uphold their actions, even when the injustice to Blacks was obvious. There's an example that they give. And then further down, it says, as the crisis, the journal of the NAACP noted after conducting its own investigation of the Louisville police force, the policemen act upon the assumption that a Negro has no rights, civil or political, that a police bully is bound to respect. So that's the bad part, right? I do want to talk about some of the positive things as is related to race in the history of Louisville. We do know just over a week ago that Yvette Gentry was appointed as the interim chief of police for LMPD, and she was the first Black woman chief, I think, in our state in 2020. And so I think it's interesting that you can look almost 100 years ago in 1923 when the first Black police woman was hired for the Louisville Police Department. I'm probably going to say her last name wrong, but her name is Bertha Wedby. And you can read about her and the other woman who became a police officer with her. I think it is important to note that she was an officer from 1922 to 1928. Leadership came in and said they didn't want women police officers anymore. And I believe the next Black woman police officer for Louisville was in the 1950s. But just because things are different, and I want to talk about intersectionality and not just race, but the intersection of race and gender. Dunlap, the other woman, and Wedby restricted patrolling dance halls, apprehending thieves in downtown department stores, working with children, and performing female body searches. So even though Louisville can probably claim to be one of the first cities that hired a Black police woman, you can still see that there were differences in how they were able to police at the time. So I thought that historical fact was important since it's been almost 100 years ago, and we now have the first Black woman police chief in Louisville, but also in our state. So really quick, have that much time. I didn't want to just put my picture on here, but I just happened to be on here. But the Southern Police Institute, I mentioned that it is housed by the building where I work. And I think it's important that I talk a little bit about that because it is something that's in our city, and it is a source and resource that we should be using as we think about moving forward. And it is a resource and source that we should be holding accountable for that, and for this reason. And that's why I included this slide. So the Southern Police Institute is over 60 years old, and I don't think a lot of people know what the initial founding was for, so I put it on here. And so they founded the Southern Police Institute based on a book called American Dilemma, where Gunnar Myrdal said this: "It is my conviction that one of the most potent strategic measures to improve the Southern interracial situation would be the opening of a pioneering modern police college in the give a thorough social and pedagogical training as well as a technical police training." So currently, the Southern Police Institute still exists. As Department Chair of Criminal Justice, it is under my purview. We have talked a lot in the last couple of months about how what they're doing could make a positive impact on police leaders. They currently have something called the Administrative Officers Course, which is a 3-month program where police leaders from across the country come in and learn different skills and academic skills related to police leadership. One of the things that I know that we need to do is include more things about racial justice and social change and social movements, so that we can actually do with what Gunnar Myrdal suggested when he wrote this in The American Dilemma. So I'm about done, David. So I know we're going to have here in just a minute. But I did want to close with my thoughts about the future. So we know the past. We looked even up until the 1950s. If you're from Louisville, you remember the 1990s. I wrote my master's thesis at the University of Louisville on racial profiling in 1999. We had a tough time there in the 90s with use of force and use of deadly force against particularly Black men. Cincinnati was having a similar issue simultaneously. And so we know our modern history. It's not a secret. We have social media, we have the internet. And so I didn't feel like I wanted to spend a whole lot of time talking about that, because I think we should know that. I also didn't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about statistics, because as a researcher who often gets funded to do research on racial disparities, I'm kind of over it, because we know that it exists. We know the disparities exist. We have to start moving into figuring out why and fixing. So some of the barriers to change, as I see and as the literature shows, to police reform, and I don't think these are things people haven't talked about, are police union and collective bargaining agreements. I've had a conversation, I don't remember which one it was. I've had lots of conversations virtually on panels here lately, but I remember having one, I believe it was last week, and talked about a study by John Rappaport where they studied Florida, and they did a controlled experiment looking at a police department that had just created a union and gotten a collective bargaining agreement, and then used the control group of a police department that already had one. And they compared the experimental group with the control group to see what would happen once police officers felt protected by the collective bargaining agreement. And what they found in this study is that the police department, it was actually a sheriff's office, once they got the protection of the collective bargaining agreement, the police use of force and police brutality increased. So they found a relationship between police unionization and increased police use of force or police brutality. So that's an interesting study. That's something people should look at as relates to how, if we're going to do any kind of police reform, there is a barrier to that with police unions. The other thing that I think is important is for us to examine purge clauses. I don't know the local union contract. I've not looked at it. But if there is a purge clause in that, and the purge clause is where after so many years, the officer's record is purged. So if they were to move on to another agency, then that information about any misconduct or any write-ups or whatnot would not go with them. And so purge clauses can be a barrier to change as well. Use of force insurance. I know with the Breonna Taylor settlement last week, people saw in the newspaper how the settlement was broken down, and $5 million of that insurance. And so I think there needs to be an examination of insurance companies that provide protection for police brutality cases. And then finally, because I am a professor, I have to talk about training and education. I'm not, again, saying that Germany is a blueprint, but I do want to acknowledge that Germany, it takes 2.5 years to become a police officer. Cadets take classes in law, ethics, and then I put this in capital letters, in police history. We don't need any more skewed and misinformed police history. We certainly don't need our officers believing that as well. And then the police there do not handle minor infractions either. And so that is a really short, condensed, what could be like a whole semester long class of criminal justice reform that could have included things about bail reform and all kinds of different things. And so I just wanted to, kind of ground us so we can talk about our present and our future.
All right. Well, Dr. Dawson Edwards, I appreciate your presentation. And so I want to talk about, let's get into a little bit, you talked a lot from the standpoint of, from the history of policing. And shared some thoughts there. I want to jump to the other side, I guess, of that coin, which is in regard to the criminal justice system itself. You mentioned early on your work is focused on now trying to keep individuals out of the system. Kind of explain that a little bit further. What your work is now in terms of keeping folks out, and what can be done to do that from our perspective.
So I can tell you about mine and tell you what I suggest, perhaps. My angle is to prevent youth from being in the justice system. And so, my research on juvenile justice kicked me back into working with the schools. And so it's interesting. A lot of people in this community think that I work for JCPS, but I don't. I work for U of L, and I'm a researcher that studies things like schools, and I have studied JCPS for sure. And so my thought there is that, if we can provide alternatives for justice and discipline at the school level, then the kids don't have to have any interaction with the justice system. Because once you have contact with the justice system, you're more likely to go deeper and deeper into the justice system. And we just, that's something that I do not want. As it relates to keeping community members that are not necessarily children out of the justice system, I think we have to really reimagine what community safety is. And I think there's a confusion between public safety and community safety, and that language that needs to be shared and understood. So public safety is your police, it is, fire, it is those public agencies. Community safety doesn't have to just be that. And so we have to think about what folks want in our community that makes them feel safe. And people have to recognize that just because the police make you feel safe doesn't mean that everyone feels safe when they have any interaction with the police or even see the police. And we have to come to a common understanding of what community safety looks like for everyone in this city, and not just presume that the police make everyone feel safe, because that's not true.
So let's go a little bit deeper on that thought right there. You mentioned a lot about, and kind of sharing with us, the history that law enforcement has played, how it's played out within the African American community more in particular. Then why is it important for those that are in law enforcement to have an understanding of that history? So go along with the positive side of, here's what the advancements we've made in law enforcement and how things have been done, but then also understanding, here's how the way that the law has been applied, or the way that law enforcement has been executed against certain communities, has a negative impact. How is that important for a person in law enforcement to do their job?
I think it's important, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of the Breonna Taylor civil suit settlement and the police reforms that were mandated. And there were 3 of them that were related to community and community building and community partnership and collaboration. And I think when you understand the history of how police have been perceived in certain communities, whether it's, by lived experience, whether it's transmitted down culturally, whatever, the perception is there. And we all know the cliche that perception is reality. And perception, I mean, it is often reality. I think understanding the historical problems between police as a concept and Black folks as a people would help people understand why there's such a sometimes visceral reaction to policing Black bodies today. And that's why I say it's something that we have to acknowledge. It is a truth. It is truth telling. And if we ever want to lead, and people who know me know that I say this all the time, I stole it. It's Equal Justice Initiative, but truth telling leads to healing and then reconciliation. We can't skip the truth and think, oh, well, we're tired of living like this and people feeling like this. Let's just stop talking about it and then we can move on. No, we tried that. We tried that with civil rights, right? We have a new time. Let's move on. We don't talk about these things. And I think that that's why we are today in our country, in our community, because we don't do truth telling well. Truth telling is hurtful. Truth telling makes people feel guilty. Truth telling makes people it makes people want to shut down. We have to figure out a way to open up that communication so that we can understand each other in this community. And that includes police officers understanding why certain people in this community would prefer an alternative to policing.
Mm-hmm. So what role does from the standpoint and the prosecutor play as it relates to criminal justice and how that's executed, here in Louisville and just in a broader context throughout the country? I think you mentioned early on how there is a disparity that the fact is that African Americans and others don't commit different crimes. It's just or act differently, but there's the way that punishment is rendered is different.
Exactly. Yeah, and so another hat that I wear is the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff that I do, where I do some consulting with justice serving agencies. One of the research projects that I did several years ago was actually on juvenile justice, but it actually ended up influencing more than just. But I did research on racial disparities in the juvenile justice system, looking at 4 counties in the state of Kentucky. One of them was Jefferson. And the recommendations from that report was for justice serving organizations, whether it's the administrative office of the courts, whether it's Louisville Metro Police Department, whoever it is, that they need to go through an equity audit and look at their work from an organizational equity lens. And I'm proud to say that the administrative office of the courts, particularly the Family and Juvenile Services Division, for the last 4 years has been undergoing that. And other aspects of the court system are now doing that work as well. And so they start with like an implicit bias series, but then they do a data dive into their data. They do or I think it's called a data walk. And they spend a lot of time understanding who they are and how their decisions be skewed by their own biases or just biases built into structures and systems. And so I think that is an example of how the courts can be impacted and how they can, reassess how they're processing things and ensure that they're not charging people differently for similarly situated things. There is quite a bit of literature that talks about how especially younger offenders are perceived as older, and it's the adultification literature. And when you think someone is older, then you treat them like they should know better instead of being a young person making really bad decisions. And that also that's not just people under 18. That's also my college age students that are experiencing that. And so certainly the courts have a role too. When we look at the system and the decision points along the system, we look at the cumulative effect of being arrested, the experiences, and you still see racial disparities at every stage of the system, regardless of if it's the adult system or the juvenile justice system. I will say this, that I remember I think it's Philadelphia, that their local prosecutor was able to make some significant changes related to how people were charged and racial disparities. And so I think that there are some examples in our country of where prosecutors at that stage of the justice system can be gatekeepers and make sure that, and ensuring that people are not treated disparately or racialized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So talk us a little bit more about how, if a individual gets brought into the system, or they start in interacting more frequently with the criminal justice system, what effect does that have on them and their lives going forward, and for that matter, even their more distant family as well?
So concentrated incarceration and concentrated poverty, and well, it's changing in this state right now, but I would say concentrated disenfranchisement, meaning voting blocks are affected. There's lots of collateral consequences to contact with the justice system, and there certainly are collateral consequences to convictions. And so there's this idea that people moving, it's called coercive mobility, and it's the people being coercively moved in and out of communities like incarceration does disrupts the social networks of that community even worse. And so there's this line of literature and research by a criminologist named Todd Clear about the disruption that incarceration and criminal justice contact has on the social fabric of communities. And so while from a law and order perspective, you think, oh, tough on crime, we're going to get rid of the bad people. So you remove fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers and aunts and uncles from those communities for sure. 97 to 99% of offenders are going to come back to the community. So you put them in an institution that's not necessarily really designed to make them better. And then you move them from that institution back into their communities. And the argument there is that that's what creates socially or that's what contributes to socially disorganized communities. And while law and order people think that's a solution, they don't think about what it does to the fabric of the community, especially when lots of those people didn't pose to folks. And there's been framing that certain crimes are violent, even if the person who was in possession of a certain drug wasn't being violent. There's a presumption that they're a violent individual, which is what has been used historically to incarcerate them for longer times and for in prisons as opposed to a local jail.
I got you. So yeah, I understand. I understand that. There's a question we've received from the audience, and I would also want to encourage everyone who's watching. If you do have a question, be sure to email our folks at GLI so they can have that question to the extent the time allows us to have it be asked. And the question here is: what laws currently exist to hold officers criminally accountable for their actions?
There's no specific for police officers. I think the opposite is true, where they're immune from certain things and protected. And I want to say this because I think people think when I talk about criminal justice reform that I'm completely anti-police. I am not. I teach police officers. I'm co-creating a class to teach with an LMPD officer in the spring. He's one of my favorite former students. We're teaching a special topics class called Police Protest in a Pandemic. But when I say this from an academic perspective, and I'm not a lawyer, but there are things put in place to ensure that public servants can do their jobs. And it's not just police. Other public servants are protected by different type of immunity standards as well. And so there is no law necessarily that holds the police particularly accountable for their wrongdoing. It usually falls in the category of if they violated department policy, did the wrong thing, they're not protected necessarily by any immunity. And so the law that would apply to them is the same law that would apply to me. I just don't have the immunity protections of doing this particular thing under the guise of my job or in good faith. And I think one of the things the public needs to understand about public servants, and particularly the police, is that they are often protected by the concept of they did it in good faith, that they have to make these decisions and they make this decision with the good faith and good intentions. And that is a hard thing to accept because, I had a disagreement with someone recently about a rave alert that went out on our campus that was supposedly, defended not by our campus leaders, but by people in our campus community, that the officer did it on good faith and with good intentions. And I say, yeah, well, those good intentions could have Black men on campus wearing red hoodies running, because there was no crime. And so the concept of good faith is something that police hold strong and the justice system allows them to hold on to. But that good faith doesn't always feel that way for community members who see it as a danger or harm to us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Edwards-Dawson, we could go on for, I'm sure, like you said, for a semester.
Absolutely.
To really kind of unpacking it and trying to understand it. I appreciate you spending some time with us this afternoon to do so, and look forward to having further conversation with you and others in the future. To everyone who is watching this, again, I want to thank you I'm going to turn this over to Sarah Devashier Wisdom for some closing comments. But before I do that, I do want to say that I want to thank you for starting with us this afternoon. As I've said in my opening remarks, that the situation that we're in right now did not happen overnight. Will it be solved overnight? But it will only happen as a result of those people of good conscience and of goodwill come together to make positive change for our community. And so we want to encourage everyone in the business community and beyond to use the levers of influence that we possess to try to bring about change. And all of us have those levers because we're all citizens of our city. And we also wanted to make it very clear that in this time that we're in, this is not an us versus them situation. It is not, if you're for those who protest, that you're against police, nor if you're policing, that you're against those who are committing crime, or that you're against other folks who are in our community who may have committed a crime. What my hope is out of all of this is that we will learn to embrace and exercise empathy, being able to see ourselves in somebody else who does not look like us, who may not come from the same community that we come from, who may not practice the same religion that we do, but I see them as in my faith tradition, I would say, as a child of God. And that if I see myself in them, then I will act accordingly, and I will show them grace and mercy as I would want them to show it unto me. And so with that, Sarah, I'm going to pass it on to you to close us out.
Thank you, David. That is so very well said. And I just want to say that I think these are exactly the kinds of conversations that we need to be having, not just to benefit our communities of color, but to benefit our entire community. This has been a very powerful conversation today. I'd like to give a final thanks to our sponsors, Papa John's International, Brown-Forman, Humana, Yum Brands, the Oliver Group, Morales Group Staffing, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Tops Magazine. This really is important work, and GLI is all in on making significant strides to addressing racial equity issues and supporting our communities of color. Our next conversation will be racial inequity in business, and it will involve discussion of access to health care. It will be held on Monday, September 28th from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Please go to greaterlouisville.com for more information on our speaker for that program. Also, if you are a member of the Business Council to End Racism's Criminal Justice Reform and Law Enforcement work stream, please enjoy this 15-minute break, and then our post-event discussion will begin at 4:15 the Zoom link that you were sent in advance. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you again virtually very soon.